Imagine waking up one morning and the sun is wrong. It still rises, but it gives almost no warmth and almost no light. It hangs there as a pale blue disk you can stare straight at, like the moon at noon. The shadows are thin and weak. The air holds a chill that never quite lifts. And this isn't one strange morning that you'll talk about for years afterward. This is every morning for the next 18 months. This actually happened. The year was 536, and people across the world wrote it down because they were frightened and because they wanted someone someday to understand what they had lived through. A Byzantine writer named Procopius described a sun that shone all year without its usual brightness, like the sun, he said, in a permanent eclipse. In Italy, a Roman official named Cassiodorus wrote of a winter with no storms, a spring with no mildness, and a summer with no heat. The crops, he said, sat in the fields and simply refused to ripen. Far away in China, court records describe snow falling in the middle of summer, and a frost that killed the harvest where it stood. In Ireland, the annals note simply a failure of bread. Nobody knew why. They only knew that the sky had changed, and that the food was beginning to fail. And it kept failing. When the sun is dim and the summers stay cold, grain never fills out. The harvest comes in thin, or it doesn't come at all. So you eat through whatever you stored last year. Then you start eating the grain you had set aside to plant. And then there is nothing left to plant and nothing to wait for. Hunger like that doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in over seasons, quietly, while everyone keeps telling each other that next year, surely, the sun will come back. For most of history, why any of this happened stayed a mystery. People had their theories, but no proof. Then, centuries later, scientists went looking in the one place that keeps an honest, unbroken diary of the sky: ice. Deep in the glaciers of Greenland and the Alps, snow falls and never fully melts. Each year lays down a fresh layer, and each layer quietly traps a little of whatever was drifting in the air at the time: dust, ash, pollen. Drill straight down through the ice, and you can read the years backwards, one after another, like counting the rings in a tree. And the trees agree. Cut into a trunk old enough, and the growth rings for these very years pinch suddenly thin. The mark of summers too cold to grow in. In the ice layer for early 536, researchers found tiny shards of volcanic glass. A massive eruption, most likely in Iceland, had thrown so much ash and sulfur high into the upper atmosphere that it spread across the entire northern half of the planet. A thin grey veil hanging in the sky between the Earth and the Sun. Historians now even have a name for it. They call it the dust veil event. That veil is what dimmed the light, and by dimming the light, it slowly cooled the whole world. The summers that followed were the coldest in around 2,000 years, and just as people were beginning to recover, it happened again. Another huge eruption in 540, and then a third, a few years after that. 3 blows, one after another, before the world could even catch its breath. The cold didn't lift for a generation. Historians have a name for this long winter too. They call it the Late Antique Little Ice Age, and by some estimates, it lasted well over 100 years. But the cold was only the first blow, because the second one was alive. In 541, into a world already worn down by years of hunger, came a sickness. It reached Constantinople, the greatest and richest city of the age, and it spread out from there along the very same ships that carried the grain. We now know exactly what it was. Bubonic plague, the same disease that would return 8 centuries later as the Black Death. It moved through a population that was already starving, already grieving, already thin, and it did not spare the powerful. The emperor himself, Justinian, caught it and somehow survived. The city around him did not fare so well. One chronicler claimed that, at its very worst, 10,000 people were dying every single day. That number is almost certainly too high, but every account that survives agrees on the same terrible shape. There were not enough living left to bury the dead, so if you were keeping count, a sun gone grey. A harvest that failed, years of slow famine, and then plague, all of it stacked one on top of the other in barely 5 years. That is why, when a historian was once asked to name the single worst year in all of human history, he did not pick a year of some famous war or some terrible battle. He picked 536. It is tempting to think that a year like that simply stops the world, but it doesn't. It quietly reshapes it. The old economies of the Roman world stalled for generations. Trade thinned out, cities shrank, empires that were already strained began to crack and shift, and new powers rose up into the gaps they left behind. Many historians believe that the slow unraveling of the ancient world and the long, quiet centuries that followed were pushed along by that one grey sky. And here is the part that is easy to miss. We only know when the world finally recovered because of the ice. Again. Around the year 640, the glaciers begin to show faint traces of lead. Pollution, the residue of people smelting silver, making coins, trading, building. After 100 years of cold and quiet, the chimneys were smoking once more. Life had restarted. You will almost certainly never live through a year like 536. But everyone who did had good reason to believe that the world itself might simply be ending. The sun had turned grey, the crops would not grow, the dead outnumbered the living, and they had no way of knowing that a full century later someone would melt enough silver to leave a faint mark in a glacier. A small accidental signal frozen into the ice that says, very quietly, across all of that distance, "We made it through. The sun came back, it always has." And somewhere deep in the ice, there is a thin grey line that still remembers the year it almost didn't.